Hello and Assalamu alaikum to our Muslim guests today. I am Raina Sawalhi. I am the Education Director at the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. And I work with Amaarah DeCuir on a variety of education programs related to the needs of Islamic schools in both the U.S. as well as internationally. So it's my pleasure to be here today in that capacity and to hear from our panel about this book that has come together as a result of collaborations across international borders and showcases a desire to contribute to the conversation about Islamic practices related to administration and management, which I know personally is a passion of Dr. DeCuir's for many, many years. So it's lovely to see how that has transformed into this particular book. So I have the pleasure of sharing the format of today's discussion. So we will have each of the guest writers and editors of the book speak for about 10 minutes each on the chapter that they contributed to the book. And I believe Dr. Arar will be doing the introductory remarks and describing how the framework of the book was created. And I will also be managing the question and answer session at the end. And to combine the hybrid, the virtual and the in-person space, we have a lot of wonderful people here. So we'll be managing and fielding questions from both the guests joining on Zoom as well as those in the room today. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Hello, Assalamualaikum. My name is Katsia, and I'm a student here at American University School of Education, studying elementary education. I also serve as the president of the Muslim Student Association here, and it is my pleasure to introduce the lead editor of the book, Dr. Khalid Arar, a professor of educational leadership and policy, doctoral programs at the College of Education at Texas State University. His international and comparative research scholarship included a connection for justice, equity, and diversity in educational leadership and policy. His research interests contribute to novel, robust, and significant way to the scholarship of social justice leadership and policy, more specifically to the area of refugee welcome education. For the past 2 decades, he has conducted studies in the Middle East, Europe, the Mediterranean, North America, and the United States, and published hundreds of scholarly papers and books. He was recently awarded the title of Honorary Professors of International Studies at Texas State University, and this year, AERA Division A honored him with the Excellence in Research Award 2023.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invite. I can say that being here today, I think I'm blessed and I'm thankful for the space, for the invite, for the hospitality. So it takes teaching and learning takes first invitation and deep hospitality. And like being, in a welcoming, space. So thank you for your welcome. So let me tell you how this book started. Because you can read about the book, you can read about the scholarship, but how all of this started. So I can say that my first invitation to Dr. Amaarah was a few years ago when we tackled emotions, education, and education and leadership. And we moved similarly to an edited book, and from there, we moved also for a special issue, and we tried to create a space where we align holistic understanding while dealing with education, where the discourse is discourse of failure, discourse of success, discourse of improvement, which is mechanic, technical, and belongs to the industrial revolution. So then from there, we continue to be in different, spaces of collaboration until in 2017, I tried to take along with me an anthropologist and to look into the scholarship of multicultural education. Where this started? Is it only 50 years that, so we dig into 2,000 years back and we try to analyze Al-Qabisi, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Sahnun scholarship. And we provided evidences that all the humanitarian stances were there in their text. But here we go, we need to publish this somewhere, and the journey starts, where who sets the agenda for publication? How comes? So this was, like a challenge of, I think after fifth revision, where this paper, could make it throughout, like, a journal. So this was one space that we started, and we needed to make conversation, deeper conversation, where there's no West and East, there's no global South and global North, but intercultural fertilization, because there's no single culture that can claim, any kind of border. When I turn to coffee, I know where coffee came from and how it arrives to the West. When I tend to tomato, I know how this, and when I tend to different spices, I know that India is sitting at my table and Pakistan is there. And it is similarly the way that birds can make it without borders and spaces. They can make it. And the whole national and nationalism is only a product of 200 years only. It's not that much. It's not that much where we want to create borders, exclusionary borders. So back to the scholarship so with that paper, we started to identify a kind of gap. So what happened since the 13th century until now? What defines Islam, Muslim scholarship? And within this scholarship, there were different exclusionary practices. If I go to CRT, it is the same. It is the same. So there is a dominance and a control of knowledge. So in this book, before starting the journey, we tried to scan the literature. Can I move? Yeah. So we tried to scan the literature on educational leadership and Islamic-based education and leadership, I need to. This laptop belongs to my expensive one. I say this because translation from Arar is, so we keep doing little jobs about this. So it seeks to review the literature between 1990 and 2020. What's going on in this literature as far as to K-12 Islamic leadership and policy. And we posed the following main question. What is the volume of literature published in Islamic education leadership? What is the geographic distribution of this Islamic education and leadership literature? What are the general trends of publication in Islamic education and leadership and policy research? And what is the topical focus of the publication regarding education and leadership and policy? Also, we tried also to identify, the journals that publish this type of. So this was like the first step, and this is the first work to be done on examining the literature so that we can identify, gaps, coverage, etc. So we can identify 1,070 publications where we needed to read all abstracts and go down up to the publications that make it our inclusion criteria. So as you can see, as far as to the volume of publication, we see that there started to be like a jump in 2018, and this is because of dynamics of globalization. We can speak now, about the size of population of people who move that quite equal, the population of the United States. People who move are, counted about, 300 million people are involved with different facets, moves for work, and moves for like life, up to refugees, displaced, etc. So this scholarship, given globalization, given displaced migration and different work agendas, so this scholarship started to increase. As far as the type of the studies, most of the studies are, as you can see, conceptual. Several are empirical, while the most used methodology was qual, list of one, and mixed methods, so that this, throughout this we can identify. Look at the scholarship. Do you see here any Arab country that supported this scholarship? It's amazing that this scholarship is coming especially from scholars in the West. Also, of course, we dig into the names and who is doing what, but these are the countries that published this work. As far as to the journals, so religions, British Journal of Religious Education, Education and Administration and Leadership, Journal of Education, Administration and History, Race, Ethnicity and Education, with the most published journal. As you can see, the studies mention spirituality and leadership because it's a different type of leadership. When we speak about Islamic-based leadership, it is based on spirituality, where this was like a core topic. Administration, stressors, etc. was the following, and then Islamic schooling, another following topic. As far as to leadership and leadership models and features, faith-based leadership was the most examined topic. Then charismatic leaderships, spiritual leadership, and community-based leadership, cultural relevant, democratic leadership, and strategic leadership. From this overview, of course, you can dig into the book, the chapter deeply. So in the context of the United States, one of the scholars that her work was evident in terms of trying to promote an agenda of gender and leadership, and throughout Islamic thought, while trying to dismantle the gender binary understanding and towards a holistic understanding. So your work was among the work that we identified. So I'm speaking your work, Amaarah. Gender has been exemplified throughout different resistance regimes and practices of feminism, but a different type of feminism that we use. So it's a faith-based and community-based and not a binary feminism, and social justice of enabling school leaders, prioritizing equity, community, and resistance were among the scholarship that in American Islamic-based schools have been extensively discussed. So I want to move to concluding thoughts so that my colleagues can also share their chapters. So the majority of these studies conducted mainly in Asia, where the West comes, remarkably after Asia, while less publications came from Arab country. It is also, this study showed that a severe lack of studies about Islamic education and leadership. And this was one of the contributions of this book, that we tried to set the stage in terms of identifying terms that scholars can use. The general claim of publication revolved around Islamic education and leadership and policy, while few studies conducted systemic review on spirituality and leadership. So this is an area that can be further explored. The paper also interpreted empirical methods and less conceptual and commentaries. And also there is a kind of lack of rigor in terms of conceptualizing Islamic-based education and leadership, which took us to this book to conceptualize this. And I think Dr. Amaarah can agree with me that it took us a bunch of time to edit the book, but another equal bunch of time to end up the last chapter, because we needed to synthesize, and we were of less agreement than agreement, and we needed to come up with a model that first set the stage in terms of what are the terms that we need to use, what we synthesize out of the 15 chapters that we got in the book, and what is the next research and policy, leadership, professional development, and praxis agenda, intending, as the dean started, intending to Muslim children and our education, either public or private, in the United States and other spaces in the world. I want to stop here so to let others leave from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arar, for those framing remarks and introducing our book project to our audience. It is my pleasure to introduce my first mentor in higher education and also one of my first professors, Dr. Ade Tekla-Selassie, an associate professor of educational administration at the George Washington University. Dr. Tekla-Selassie's research interests include resiliency and the development of protective factors among at-risk students, job satisfaction and mobility patterns of school principals, educational reform and policy in the international context, and women and minorities in educational leadership. In 2014 and 15, he was a U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Ethiopia, where he conducted research on school leadership development for school renewal, closing the research, policy, and practice gap in higher education in Ethiopia, and understanding the professional trajectories of successful women educational leaders. We have asked him to join us this afternoon and offer remarks about education leadership in the international context, reflecting on our co-edited volume. Dr. Tekla-Selassie.
Dr. DeCuir, thank you for that nice introduction. Every moment I learn it from you, so today as well, I'm sure I will learn from our colleagues here. Can you hear me well? My sound, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. So as I reflect reading this book, I just want to start with my own positionality as a scholar from Global South. I was born and raised in sub-Saharan Africa, in Ethiopia. I was a high school principal there and also a university faculty member, a department chair in the educational leadership and administration program at Addis Ababa University. At the time, that was really 25 years ago. You know, I was educated through books, research, and, you know, scholars who were often educated in the West. So growing up, teaching and serving as a university faculty member, we always had a bottomless desire for the Western scholarship. The Western scholarship was the gold mark that we try to mirror our research, our teaching, our courses that we design for our educational leadership programs. In the hindsight, years after, I keep on asking this question. What is the lure for Western scholarship? Of course, Western countries are developed economically. Even when we know that best leadership practices are tethered in the local context, even when we know that the Western models that we borrowed didn't really lead to sustainable development in education, in economic and other spheres. I even question that, unlike many African countries, Ethiopia was not successfully colonized, and there is indigenous thousands of years of church and Quranic education in the country. Why did we not really use at least part of our local wisdom to foreground our leadership preparation program? So, my question of why scholars from the global south and the field of educational leadership continues to rely too much on the Western scholarship is in part, as we know, there is little written about non-Western scholarship, including Islamic-based educational leadership. So this book that you have authored really responds to this important call. That is, you are really filling the void in the research and as well as leadership preparation gap from Islamic educational leadership perspective. And this book brings new and novel perspectives regarding how culture, religion intersect as school leaders make sense of their own identity and the community in which they serve. And in my view, the book also helps us to dispel, demystify some of the assumptions, beliefs that are portrayed in much of the scholarship about Islamic-based educational leadership and scholarship. Take for an example, the hosted study on power distant cultures. I am sure you are familiar with that book. And among countries that are described as high power distant culture, where there is a huge distance in terms of empowerment between the leader and the followers, most Muslim countries are considered a high power distant culture, where followers enjoy little power. I'm trying to make sense of this finding that is written by Western scholars with little or limited knowledge about the culture, norms. Basically, they don't really have the sophisticated understanding of the socio-cultural fabric of the community about which they are right. So I'm trying to make sense of how this finding, for example, aligns with your finding about Islamic-based educational leadership, where you talked about the concept of servant leader, a guardian leader. That foregrounds that serving humans is part of Islam, as Islamic leaders serve their followers and care for their well-being. This doesn't really match up with how the broader Western scholarship portrays Islamic-based education or Islamic-based leadership. So your book is an important contribution to dispel and demystify such portrayal of Islamic-based educational leadership. And in my view, there are very successful heroine and heroic educational leaders that are really doing an important work in a difficult environment in many countries, including in Islamic schools. What do we know about the practice of these school leaders? If practice informs our theories, and also theories in turn informs practice, there are important work these school leaders are doing in different parts of the world. I had an opportunity to work on a partnership project with Saudi Arabia in the, with the University of Medina, and I traveled for 2 years between 2016 and 2018. I was able to see many school leaders who are really doing a fantastic job, especially women leaders. There is this statistics in Saudi Arabia where in every statistical measure you have it, female students actually beat male students in their educational achievement, although that doesn't match in terms of employment. This doesn't come by chance, especially in a context where there is, a single gender-based schools. There must be some important work women educational leaders are doing in those schools. But what do we know about female Islamic-based educational leadership in our research? Very little. So you have really started this important work. As you have already admitted in your study, the Islamic-based educational leadership is again in its developmental stage. There is much work remains to be done. But your work has really laid a very strong foundation. If research is about really asking, research is not about asking what we know. It's about asking what we don't know or what we don't really know enough. We know a lot about educational leadership from Western perspectives. I think the question we need to ask is this: what does Western scholarship need to know about important practices from non-Western scholarship, especially Islamic-based educational leadership, as we aim to expand or create a more inclusive, a broader conception of leadership as we globalize and work for a globalization of educational leadership as a discipline? I think there is a lot that your book will contribute to that conceptualization. And I will stop here. Thank you.
JPCC 2020 Innovation Award and was a Study UK Alumni Award finalist for social impact. In 2019, Dr. Sawalhi completed her PhD in educational leadership from the University of Warwick and published several peer-reviewed journal articles and books. She is the co-founder of Eduenterprise, a nonprofit organization registered in the USA, and has launched the Educational Leadership Lab, applying the design thinking approach and launching educational leadership coaching platform. She is the co-founder of Life and ICSEI ELN co-coordinator. Currently, Dr. Sawalhi is Deputy Director of Learning and Outreach at the Children's Museum.
Assalamu alaikum. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the kind invitation. It's an honor to be amongst you all. And this great opportunity just after you had set the stage, Dr. Arar and Dr. Abdullah, just to go through this important book. Why did we go through this journey and what are we aiming for? And I would like to thank all the authors that had contributed and participated within this volume. And as you can see that we have 3 sections where we try to combine their efforts to introduce the model and to highlight why are we introducing this new term if we claim that this is a new term, Islamic-based education leadership, as we see that it's not only another or extra adjective that's been added to leadership or education leadership, as much as there is an important component that we need to understand. And as you had mentioned, Doctor, is just what do researchers or practitioners need to know about other context or other researchers. So the first section will talk about between past, future, and future new insights. This is something for all of us to reflect on and to see the research that we are reading in a new lens. The second section is talking about Islamic-based education leadership in secular countries. And the third one is about models and voices and new insights from Muslim communities, which is just another invitation for you to go through all the chapters and to see what exactly are we referring to and why are we identifying that. As you had mentioned, there are many, the efforts had been in the previous centuries, but how much do we know? Either it's because of the lack of translation or because of the efforts that we're researching outside Western countries for many reasons. Now, when I was trying to explore teacher leadership in my thesis and my different studies, I was just referring, like many others, to Western contexts and trying to understand the same terms and the same ways of studying or exploring, or the methodologies had been used, which did not help me much. And while I was trying to explore and understand the nature of teacher leadership in Arab countries, that led me to something that's really important about defining and the terminology that's used. So while I was interviewing more than 96 interviewees, teachers working in public schools, and around 3,000 had participated in the online survey, there were many insights that they were referring to. And each time I was asking them about teacher leadership, they would use the terms or explanation that's coming from Hadith or coming from Quran as Muslims. So this gives me just kind of a new insight. How do we really understand the context, and how do we really just connect to the terms that we are using? So just going back, and if we go to the next slide, please, just the first thing is how we define the terms that we are referring to and the positionality that we are coming from, understanding the context, and even trying to look into a new lens. So as I mentioned, all the teachers had been referring how they define teacher leadership. They use the word murabbi, which means that they are seeking formation, that they are making sure that there is something beyond the delivery of instructional practices or information for learners. Then when I tried to ask them, do they consider themselves as teacher leaders, where I differentiate between teacher leadership and teacher leaders, where teacher leadership, any teacher can practice according to their expertise and they can lead from where they stand, where teacher leaders can be more kind of consistent practice of they have more skills and specific characteristics. All of them, they were also referring to common, like being humble or being modest, that they don't want to mention or refer to themselves as they are leaders or they are contributing or influencing others. And they were requesting that who are around them would kind of recognize their effort. And this is something really interesting, because in Islam we have the story of Messenger Joseph, talking about how he had identified his strength and exactly said to people around him that, yes, I'm capable of doing this and this, before he started his position or the new role that he was about to start. So from where did we get this understanding, and how the traditions or the people around us just affecting our understanding and the way that we're expressing ourselves, and also affecting our practices? And when I started asking them about what kind of domains, what kind of areas are they practicing leadership, all of them, they, you know, like they have different components, either for instruction practices, for professional development, for even kind of social component for helping their each other, where they were referring that they are shining in their schools. So they did not use the word leader. They did not refer to the term either in many ways that could be translated in Arabic. They were referring to the word that we are shining. that we are becoming as a light, either for learners or for our colleagues or people around us, which reminded me of Ismullah, God's name, the light, our Nur. So that's something that they continuously were referring, that this is part of their what they're doing and what they're aiming to. If we go to the next slide, please. So that helped me to create a new model to clarify and what exactly do we mean by teacher leadership and how we can recognize it with things around us. Like it's almost like the sun, and whenever that you go around them within the orbits, you would just feel and see the light in different ways. You might not be one of the direct students in this class, and that would go back to different theories related to followers and leaders, which we need to re-understand the component of leadership from an Islamic lens, where we're trying to offer opportunities either for Muslims, non-Muslims, for Muslim in secular context, or for Muslim in their Islamic or their Muslim countries, regardless of the terminology that we're having. So we need to understand the context more, and we need to understand what's the teacher's role within this and how they can contribute to the students, to their colleagues, to school leaders, communities, and internationally, where sometimes they just think that, no, I'm not capable of doing this. And that would take me just to a quick overview of how we can connect it to the conclusion of the book. If we go to the next slide, please. Where all of the teachers that I had interviewed were referring to their own beliefs. Now, regardless of how we're going to define it, either from an Islamic lens, or we can say the purpose or the meaning or the beliefs, regardless of the belief of this person or this teacher, but how exactly those beliefs are going to affect our own practices, and to what extent that we can help them to see the spiritual component of giving a meaning or a purpose of what they're doing. Then that also reminded me, as Dr. Arar had mentioned, that we had lots of effort before even the Western countries, when they introduced education theories or education kind of strategies, teaching and learning strategies. So in Islam, from the first word that had been in Quran, which is Iqra, there is a component of al-ayah, which could be understood as a miracle or could be understood as a verses of Quran. And Dr. Majid Arsan Kilani would highlight that teacher preparation programs should enable teachers to be ayatiyun, that they need to understand their holy book if they are Muslim, and they need to be able to connect it to the universe around them, just to see the miracles and how can utilize the scientific component. And that would go to many aspects. And nowadays, we're having sustainability, we're having SDGs, we're having different things that how we need to protect the environment. While that was instilled or embedded within teachers' practices across all Islamic countries, we never heard that there's any invention had affected environment in all the eras or all the ages during a golden age in Islam. And within the interviewees' kind of reflections, when they were all directly or indirectly were referring to God's name, Allah names in Islam, and how they affected their personal and their professional lives, that might be kind of a lens or an indicator that we need to go back and to reflect to what extent are we practicing what we're talking about, our own beliefs. So there are many things that we can go through, which led us and helped us to develop an ecological model. You can read at the end of the last chapter, where we try to highlight that if you're studying Islam, you need to clarify your positionality, because there are many understandings or schools of thought in Islam, either Sunni, Shia, Sufi. So you cannot generalize and say that this applies for all. And then you need to understand the context. You need to understand your own beliefs. There are many things that's affecting anything that you are describing and saying this is Islamic education leadership. That's why we're highlighting that it's based on Islam, but we cannot generalize and say that goes for all Muslim practices in all contexts. I know that this is a quick overview and a quick journey. I hope that you would enjoy reading the book as much as we enjoyed working on this, editing and reviewing with all our colleagues from different countries, and how we're trying to highlight that there's lots of efforts need to be done, and we hope that this only paving the way. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Sawalhi, for your theological input. Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Raina Ayers, and I am a graduate program coordinator here at the School of Education. It is my pleasure to introduce the third editor of the book, Dr. Amaarah DeCuir, Senior Professorial Lecturer in the School of Education and Senior Inclusive Pedagogy Fellow here at American University, and an Executive Board Member at the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. Dr. DeCuir's scholarship spans the area of anti-racist pedagogy, Muslim student experiences, prophetic pedagogy, faith erasure, equity, anti-racism, and social justice, education leadership, teacher education, and faculty development. Dr. DeCuir has published articles and chapters in peer-reviewed journals and books, and her public scholarship appears in news and media outlets. A highly regarded educator and facilitator, Dr. DeCuir teaches education studies and social justice, education leadership, and teaches 2 anti-racist research methods courses she co-designed. She brings over 20 years of teaching and leadership experiences from public and private K-12 schools to inform her current work in higher education.
So it's a pleasure to be here and to have all of you be here with me in this moment to celebrate and to talk about the launch of this book. My chapter that I'd like to present today is in the second chapter, the second section of the book, speaking about leadership context in secular countries. I began this work consistent with the other authors in an effort to engage in critical reflexivity. I first began by examining our sacred texts and also included an examination of Islamic scholarship to be able to create what I am presenting today as my articulation of Islamic-based anti-racist education leadership. We can move to the next slide. So I begin by asserting that anti-racism is not a 21st century call to action, nor a modern social concept. This is a concept that is deeply rooted in faith-based obligations that are embodied in the Quran and prophetic foundations of justice and equity. One of my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Aziza El-Hibri, she's a female American Muslim legal scholar who asserted that the centerpiece of the Islamic worldview, the way in which Muslims see the world, their relationship to the world, and their relationship to their creator, can be understood through the term adala, which is translated as divine justice. I engaged in a critical reflexive examination of the Quran, which we know is recognized by Muslims worldwide as a textual embodiment of God's words. And when you read the Quran, you find that it contains parables of justice, commandments to advance equity, and prohibitions against injustice. The Quran was revealed during a period that was fraught with racism, gender bias, and social marginalization. And it offers a social treatise of anti-racism that is defined and communicated to all people across time and place. I also refer to the Sunnah, the prophetic traditions of Prophet Muhammad, representing the preserved collections of his sayings, attributes, actions, and teaching with others around him. He's identified by Muslims as the last prophet of God. And his wife Aisha was known to have said his character was the Quran. Through this chapter, I assert that anti-racism is deeply rooted in our Islamic faith through the Quran and the Sunnah, offering perennial definitions, values, and commandments with contemporary applicability to America's inequities and injustices. We can move to the next slide. I'd like to read for you one verse from the Quran, among many, that describes the pairing of justice with faith as an obligation. It reads, "O ye who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even as against yourselves, or your parents, or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor." So notice the first part of that verse is a strong call to justice, no matter who is opposing you. For God best protect both. Follow not the lusts of your heart, yes, you swerve, and if you distort justice or decline to do justice, verily God is well acquainted with all that you do. And at the end is an admonition that for those who fail to heed this call to justice, God is aware of what you do. I'd also like to share one of the many embodiments of the prophetic tradition. This is a quote translated into English of the Prophet's last sermon. It reads, "All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, and that the Muslims constitute one brotherhood." I want you to hear from this the denunciation of white supremacy culture, as well as embodiments of all racialized privileges. We know this is consistent with the core tenet of anti-racism to dismantle all attributes of supremacist thought. The second example from the prophetic tradition is a common saying, and this is its translation into English. "Whoever of you sees an evil must then change it with his hand. If he is not able to do so, then he must change it with his tongue. And if he is not able to do so, then he must change it with his heart. And that is the slightest effect of faith." This is a very strong commandment that faith is paired with social justice and the disruption of inequities. Those inequities are communicated as evils within our society. So let me move to the next slide. I want to continue by naming that many of us are familiar with embodiments of anti-Black racism as we see it in our American society today. And on the next slide, I'd also like to name that this anti-racist framework also serves to combat anti-Muslim racism. The image that you see on the left using the word Islamophobia largely is a term that describes the bias and discrimination that often exists between individuals, rooted in a mistrust or a misunderstanding of Islam as a faith. But the image that you see in the lower right-hand corner of the screen begins to frame this as anti-Muslim racism, which we know, consistent with other forms of racism, moves systemically through our society. It moves through policies and practices beyond just interpersonal relationships. On the next slide, you'll begin to see some examples of state-sanctioned anti-Muslim racism. On the left image, you see a picture embodying the initiative in France through the legislature to prohibit women from having access to wearing the hijab in public spaces. In the lower left-hand corner, you see an image of India-occupied Kashmir, a land of Muslims. In the top right and the top middle portion of the screen, you see our American attempted a travel ban in 2015, which is understood as the Muslim ban. And in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you see an image of a woman speaking about the Uyghur community, a Muslim community in Western China, that continues to face persecution and, in the western part of China today. Moving on the next screen, both forms of racism, anti-Black racism and anti-Muslim racism, coexist within American public schools. Whether the students are from a school that is founded and maintained by a large number of Muslim immigrants to this country, or by a school that is predominantly Muslim, both forms of racism exist in our schools, and our leaders work hard to be able to disrupt that. So in addition to my critical reflexivity of sacred texts, I also reanalyzed qualitative data collected nationally in 2013 for Muslim women, a leading American Muslim schools. We can move to the next slide. This more recent analysis uses anti-racist education lens to consider how Muslim women lead schools to advance anti-racism. Drawing upon my previous role as a Muslim woman leading an American Islamic school, what follows is an original framework rooted in critical reflexivity of their leadership experiences. I assert this framework, this anti-racist framework, having 4 key pillars. The first being resistance. One attribute of Islamic anti-racist school leadership is to lead a school community to demonstrate resistance against any embodiment of racism. One common form of anti-Muslim racism and bias is the narrowly defined social expectations that are assigned to Muslim women as being quiet, subservient, and weak. These biases exist both external and internal to the Muslim school community. Externally, they reflect a larger social narrative of anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. Internally, it is recognized as a reproduction of gender-based bias and patriarchy that marginalizes Muslim women and their leadership efforts. These school leaders also actively promoted anti-racist leadership by leading their school communities to demonstrate resistance against multiple types of racism and injustice in their local areas. In addition to resistance, these women embody transformation. And we know that anti-racism seeks to transform systems, practices, and beliefs in our society to establish the perceived and realized equality of races. Islam, understood as a way of life, is a transformative faith that impacts social and public systems, as well as personal interactions, by establishing equity and justice through God consciousness. Across the network of school leaders included in this study, most of the women structured their transformative leadership actions around a prophetic practice of consensus building. This is a leadership practice of seeking consultation and collaboration from others to advance shared agendas for a community. And it directly challenges authoritarian forms of leadership that consolidate power, often around a single individual. These women also engaged in disruption. The leaders within American Muslim schools were able to identify inequities within their school communities that they sought to disrupt as manifestations of their anti-racist leadership commitments. They used data literacy practices to assess student achievement and student experiences within their schools, not to advance confirmation bias, but to identify inequities that they would disrupt. The women in my study also engaged in critical self-reflection of their own leadership experiences within their school community and had early realizations that they faced inequitable treatment, often at the hands of the board of directors. This motivated them to speak out against all forms of injustice that they faced as leaders. They drew their motivation from Quranic stories of prophets, particularly Moses, whose prophethood was declared to disrupt oppression faced by his people, or Prophet Muhammad, who sought to disrupt gender and social inequities throughout his prophethood. And lastly, faith. Faith is often described in our society as an embodiment of one's personal relationship to the Almighty. and few associated with leadership practice. But women leading American Muslim schools recognize that the demonstration of their faith was a core component of their leadership work. Leaders of American Muslim schools also consider their faith as manifestations of anti-racist values. Their faith motivates their leadership work. Their faith enables them to recognize inequities and injustices. Their faith holds them accountable for the alignment of their beliefs, mindsets, and actions. And because their faith remains challenged in the public square, their visible commitments to faith-based leadership is understood as a rebuke of anti-Muslim racism. So together, these four components of resistance, transformation, disruption, and faith compose the four pillars of the framework that I am advancing through this chapter. I'd like to close with 3 recommendations on the next slide on how we can move forward from this. 1, far too often, and it's been named a number of times in this panel thus far, leadership in Muslim context has not been examined as a site for educational advancement or social change. Muslim community knowledge is often devalued as violent doctrine that opposes social development, hyper-focusing on narrowly interpreted religious dictates and obscuring Muslim secular experiences. But we can reclaim this century and begin to see Muslim spaces as sites of the examination of leadership. Secondly, we need to center women's leadership. This becomes a site for dismantling patriarchy, and it creates an expansive view of education leadership to include multiple enactments of leadership. These women led in unique ways because of their gender, and that should be studied more closely. And lastly, to advance future research, we need our Islamic legal scholars to consider the work of leading in Muslim minoritized spaces. Too often, America and the West are not sites of examination for Islamic legal scholarship. But there are unique forms of leadership that are taking place in our unique settings, and we need to come together with the scholars of religious studies to better understand what are we experiencing today and how this can help to advance the needs of Muslim communities globally. Thank you for allowing me to share my remarks, and I look forward to our last co-editor speaking.
Thank you, Dr. DeCuir, for those insightful remarks. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. My name is Amaarah, and I'm a student in the UD program here at American University. I'm also a senior policy program specialist at the National Education Association. It's my pleasure to introduce to all the fourth editor of the book, Dr. Tasneem Amatullah, who is an assistant professor at the Emirates College for Advanced Education in the United Arab Emirates, with over 20 years of experience in K-12 and higher education. She teaches school effectiveness, improvement evaluation, capacity building, and educational leadership for school improvement courses. Before this, Dr. Amatullah taught foundational courses in education, diversity in education, and multicultural education at the State University of New York and Miami University, both in the United States. Her research centers on the issues of equity, social justice, school-university research partnerships, educational leadership, specifically Islamic leadership, and policy analysis around the globe, and has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. Currently, she is working on projects focusing on leadership licensure, professional development of teachers and leaders, and item response theory. Dr. Amatullah holds a PhD in educational leadership from Miami University in USA.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introductions. And Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Dr. Amaarah, for this wonderful opportunity to share and spread the work that we have put together around a much needed, scholarship of Islamic-based educational leadership. So what I share here today is coming out from my dissertation research about female Islamic leadership practices in the context of Qatar, a small Gulf nation, which is actually the size of a Connecticut. So what I'm drawing here is one of the narratives that was developed as part of my work out of the 3 leadership stories that I put together in my dissertation. So the focus here is to understand and explore a very thick story of what it is to be a female Qatari educational leader in the context of Qatar in higher education, and trying to explore how she has maneuvered her leadership role, and then analyzing what her story says in the light of an Islamic leadership framework. So the background, as I said, it is from the country Qatar, and as we know, this nation practices Sharia as its legislative law, which is, following the Islamic teachings, the Quran, and the Sunnah of the Prophet. However, the country is also progressive in its way of practicing Islam. Yes, the religious, traditions and values and practices are present and heavily practiced, but at the same time, they're very open-minded and give significance to critical thinking skills and integrate it in their education system. And definitely the country is, very ambitious to develop and sustain human capacity. They want to move away from, the natural resources-based kind of economy to a knowledge-based economy. And this is happening with, collective participation from the entire community in Qatar. And there is a high participation of women in the workforce there. However, it's again, depending upon what positions the women take and how they perform their roles, but we can see many, many, many females in the top leadership roles in Qatar. So here, what I use is the Islamic educational leadership theory and practice, although very, little literature is published around this scope, but there were some nice, scholarly dissertations published in this area. A few very highly recognized scholars who had written some, peer-reviewed journal manuscripts. And what I chose here was a framework that comes from Dr. Asif Ipadella, who has examined the entire hadith book, Riyadh al-Salihin, which has about 1,896, teachings and sayings of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he put together a framework which I utilize in my study. But also I draw from, the leadership, educational leadership discourse, and from 2 scholars. One is from Rost, which says that leadership is more about an interaction between the leader, the followers, the situation, because leadership is not just about like one particular individual, but it is a collective social responsibility and exercise which happens in a particular context, which happens in a particular situation. In addition to that, I draw from scholars Bikun and Badawi, who define leadership as a trust, which is an amana, which is something we are responsible for. And it is, again, we are accountable for our actions and deeds that we do in our leadership role. So we want to do the best to support whoever we are, accountable towards, guide them, protect them, and to treat them justly. So the conceptual framework, as I mentioned, I'm drawing from this particular dissertation, which upon the analysis of the entire Hadith book, came up with two overarching themes or the categories, we can say. So one was, after analyzing all the Hadith, the prominent theme was about the modeling and directing behaviors of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And under that category, some of the leadership behaviors that were very explicitly standing out were how our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was utilizing a personalized leadership. So he was having his own style of leadership through role modeling, and he was more, accountable and more responsible towards what the followers would require. In addition to that, the other big theme was relationship with God and humanity. So it was not just you serving, the community, but it is also you are accountable and, you're serving to Allah, to God. So devotion to God was a crucial, property, but as also you need to showcase that concern to your team members. Treatment to people was another big theme, and promoting gentleness, focus on justice and welfare for the weak and the needy was very obviously reflected throughout the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Finally, it was also the adaptive leadership. So it was not just that, yes, you're given a task and you need to do that, but it's also dependent upon what you can do, right? So based on that, the follower potential was much of importance and significance to learn from the life of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second overarching theme was based on, developed based on that leadership behaviors of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He developed a theocentric worldview, and this had two big themes, which is you have fidelity to God and his prophet, which requires an individual to engage in very conscious and active reflection in anything and everything you engage in. So that was one of the crucial things where you are accountable to Allah and his prophet. But at the same time, you are also considering, a leader is considering, the concept of you're accountable for your actions, and there is an afterlife where you need to be accountable for, right? So that was one of the, prominent themes that came out from the analysis. And it is significant to develop a faith-based identity and to serve the ummah, have strong relationships with the surroundings, the families, and we have a responsibility towards the community itself. So these are the big themes that came out of the framework that I utilize in my study. So methodologically, I chose to use an interpretivist discourse and narrative inquiry for this study to tell the story of my leader. And using these methodological options helped me to explain those stories, understand their experience and retell their stories the way they experience it and the way they narrate it. So it was not my understanding. And I also ensured to, share my understanding to confirm it with the leaders themselves. Some of the questions I asked in order to develop their story was how do you really define educational leadership? And what is the influence of your local context in your role? How do you make decisions? What is your specific leadership style? What does it mean to be a female leader? And, were there any challenges? Just closing, I asked a statement can you complete the statement for me? So what does it feel like to be a female leader in higher education in Qatar? So what the leader told me, and the way I analyzed her entire story, it looked like Sarah, my leader, was a very ambitious leader, and she explicitly mentioned, for me, it's more I communicate with the minds of the people. So that story, I'm going to, capture it in a few direct quotations from my leader. So when asked, how do you really define leadership, it becomes she was very clearly saying, I need to have a clear vision. Without that, I cannot communicate with my people. Upon commenting on, so what is it to be a female leader? She said, female leadership is much stronger than male leadership. And she was able to connect to, gender-specific roles that she used to perform in her childhood. But she was very optimistic. And she said, that actually made me more, multitasking-oriented person that men can't do. Well, this is actually debatable. So apologies to all the men around me here. And then thinking about the context, the nation itself in which she operates, she serves, she said, like, Qatar as a nation has actually supported women a lot in the recent years for education. So that empowerment is coming from the country itself, an Islamic nation. In her leadership, she is very cognizant of seeking input from all her team members and empowering her colleagues, which is a part of the Islamic leadership, consultation, shura, and all of those things, which will follow in the next slide. And she always seeks for opportunities and finds out, ways she can grow, she can support, and she can also in turn, contribute to the organization's development. A very reflexive person too. So she has learned from her mistakes, she has learned from the obstacles that she's come across. And she believes that if we don't have these obstacles, you cannot really refine your personality. But one big idea that ran across all the three stories in my dissertation was female leaders. They spoke very explicitly stating that, Islam is misconceived. We have more cultural influences that actually paints a different picture than what Islam is. So culture operates basically under the disguise of Islam. And Islam, whereas on the contrary, Islam actually empowers her and supports her in her leadership role. So those are some key ideas. And when I asked her the closing statement, what does it mean for her to be a female leader? She said, it is to have nonstop ambitions for me and fight for reliable and sustainable changes. So now, initially, when the questions were asked, there was no direct reference to how do you perceive leadership from an Islamic lens and so on. It was a very natural, just open questions related to the leadership practices. And then this theoretical lens was applied to the findings. And what I found was the two big themes that the framework offered to me, I merged them all together, and I saw several sub-themes that could fall into those main themes, such as the personalized leadership. From the quotations, you would have noticed that Sarah was actually a very visionary leader. One of the instances is what I put there. She also used to believe in empowerment, in which she used to delegate tasks to her team members. She was very task oriented. She wanted results, and she was a very responsible person too. Likewise, for the treatment of the people, she believed in, again, enabling or having that culture of respect within her team members and empowering her colleagues. Yes, she also exhibited adaptive leadership because she strongly believed in whatever the capacity of her team members, and then she would communicate with them in such a fashion that she can uplift them, she can empower them eventually through scaffolded tasks. Likewise, her relationship with God and humanity was more, around the themes of being more collaborative in nature, being very open in communication and consulting. Most of the decision-making actions came through consultation. Fidelity to God and Prophet, she was explicitly stating, in my practices, it's always in my mind that I consider what is halal, what is permitted in Islam, and I don't, really go around what is haram or forbidden in Islam. So that was the underlying, principle or value she holds for herself in her leadership role. And she, in the form of developing a faith-based identity, she was very much community-oriented person. In addition to her job itself, she was also a more community-focused person where she engaged in many empowerment tasks, counseling, and other possible activities. In addition to that particular framework, some of the supports and challenges systems also came into limelight through her story. The support system, she acknowledged that her family has been a very strong support, the supervisors throughout her graduate program, and Qatar as a country itself, supported her in her future education. With the challenges, yes, the femaleness, like, the gender segregated or, the gender stereotyped tasks were creating issues for her. But at the same time, again, as I said, she was trying to be very optimistic. She took all challenges head on and she faced them. And the other huge challenge was the culture versus Islam misinterpretation. So this led all of this synthesis and analyzing it through the leadership framework offered like 3 big recommendations or implications for leaders, because the nation is investing so much, and this has to be taken to other contexts as well. Leaders basically need to consciously self-reflect. They need to think about their own leadership practices, and specifically Muslim educational leaders need to follow the teachings from the Quran and the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. As Dr. Rania also mentioned, thinking about their own positionalities, where they are coming from and what values and principles they hold would make a leader reflexive. The second implication is for the professional development. Now, educational leadership, we have professional development, opportunities worldwide, and the countries, the context itself have to consider where they are from and how they can integrate such frameworks, especially in the Islamic nations, as part of their professional development, and how can they integrate it into that curriculum, make it a norm, And finally, for research, because this was, one case study, we could have more insights from different leaders more widely to conduct a cross-case analysis. And in fact, only one of the hadith book was used here to develop that framework. So maybe a holistic analysis of all the other hadith books will add value to the development of this Islamic leadership framework. And thank you. That is it from me. So maybe I can pass it on.
Next, you ready? You don't want to fill the questions together. Pretty sure you don't want to just fill the questions together. You and Dr. Arar.
We can. Why don't you ask for the questions? Sure. We'll field them like that. Because I'd like to include Rania and Tasneem on there.
Yeah. Thank you so much to all of the panelists today, and also the comments from Dr. Tekla, I think. I apologize for mispronouncing that. I just wanted to reflect a little bit, since he went earlier, on some of the comments that he made and remind us of his suggestions in regards to this edited volume. He mentioned that this volume dispels and demystifies certain perceptions of Islamic leadership models. He also reflected on the fact that oftentimes Western scholarship dismisses other framing, and that maybe we should be asking the question of what can we learn from Islamic Muslim societies, and maybe also what are things that we might be ignoring or overlooking in terms of leadership in particular. Female leadership in particular was something that he noted as distinctive about this volume in particular. And of the three panelists, the focus was on female leadership. So I hope that having that in mind, maybe we can take some questions from the live audience as well as the virtual audience. And we have Dr. Arar here and Dr. DeCuir, and then Dr. Sawalhi and Dr. Amatullah on Zoom.
let you know if the question comes through the chat. Anybody in here want to pose a question for us?
I actually did have a question. So there was a little bit of discussion around the lack of scholarship on this topic coming from Arab countries or even that which was translated. That a lot of this text came from what is in English translation, from what I understand. Do you think there is a deeper level? This is a question open to everyone. Do you think there's a deeper level of understanding that we can learn if there was some work done in some of the translations in native languages in Islamic-based countries?
Dr. Arar, do you want to see the part and then the people on the side?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very wise and interesting question. When we look at this, when we decided to look at this scholarship, we aimed at analyzing scholarship in English. And we know that publication agenda globally is set by Anglophonic, academic, institutions or publishing. Therefore, different translated words from Arabic to English are less evident in this regard. This is one, two. Also, there is, and this is beyond this word, there is a less spaces for robust publication in Arabic language. And three, institutions of higher education in the West tend to require publication as part of, establishing, the academic professorial, which is less evident in Arab countries and universities. Of course, I'm generalizing. There are diversities and there are differences. So this is one. The strength of this volume specifically that it represents different geographic areas. It is also represents different cultures, different spaces, different contexts. I can say that, well, some of the works came from Indonesia, Pakistan, others came from Turkey, where we could learn about different practices of education and leadership. Others came from Arab countries, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and other countries. And also different works came from the West, mainly the United States, Australia, and also the UK. So we try also to fill this gap in terms of extending this scholarship and synthesize it and also representing different spaces. Also the issue of Mediterranean, discourse, majority and minority and minoritized, discourse even in the West is another aspect that we tried also to a gap that we tried also to both discuss and cover. One of also the ambitious aims of the book was throughout the first chapter that I just presented, and the last chapter that we concluded with, we tried to also bridge the gap between the scholarship in the 13th, back to the 13th century and the contemporary and the current. because, there are different streams of scholarship where the Islamic scholarship is being, like faith-based, unless they lead to different, like praxis for education. So we try to make this bridge, if we can say, bridge between, scholarships, between people, between contexts, and like ideas. Yeah. Thank you. Do you want to add to this?
Thank you so much to the panelists, and I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. I think one of the things I'm curious about when I kind of heard across the sections and the chapters, Dr. Arar, where you started, you shared with us this idea of there being no single culture making a claim and trying to really move away from this divide between global north, global south, east, west. Then I also heard you all describing, or I would say Dr. Sawalhi describing this idea of the book really needing to focus on this idea of Islamic-based education, given the multiplicity of viewpoints within the Islamic faith and tradition. So I'm curious how across the chapters and across each of your pieces, especially given the focus on women in leadership as well, how you think about minimizing this perspective, moving from this binary perspective that the world is often based on, while at the same time lifting up the voices of the multiplicity of Islamic faiths and communities. How are you all able to show that in different ways in each of your chapters and sections of the book?
That's an excellent question. Dr. DeCuir, would you like to take it? Or? Okay, Dr. Sawalhi? Amaarah, Dr. DeCuir is suggesting that maybe you can take that one.
Yes, thank you. I heard the question and it's really interesting. We're connected also with the first question that you had addressed. There's an issue with translating and being aware of the current and the old or the previous kind of contributions, which we as Arabs or non-English speakers, or even for non-Arabic speakers, we need to make sure that we're contributing and sharing. Now, while we're identifying the status or the position or the understanding of which school of thought, if I understood the question correctly, we need to highlight that there are different understanding, and there is a difference between if referring to the holy verses of Quran, or we're referring to our understanding from that. And having a comparative studies between Arab scholars, Muslim scholars, and between Arabs or Muslims and the West. There are many things that we need to identify the methodology. We need to identify the process itself that generated the knowledge, or how we're producing the knowledge about education practices. So this is something that we need to highlight, and we had tried to address it within the book, while we're trying to identify different voices and to show that there are different ways of implementing within the module that we had presented in the last chapter, so that whatever that we're studying, or regardless of the context or the practice, there are specific things that need to be identified to help the researcher or the practitioner to understand and to have a bigger picture of what had been mentioned or identified. I hope that would answer the question. Dr. Arar, Dr. Amaarah, Tasneem, if you'd like to.
I just Rania, want to add to your excellent, answer to this. So we think that often leadership in Muslim country has not been examined in a dignifying way. So there's a kind of supremacy in terms of knowledge and knowledge production, and then this is manifesting in what we value. Do we value this knowledge as part of education change or not? And then what we try to come up with a model that hyper-focused and fractionalize different knowledge, both in the West and in the East, where the model that we presented in the end of the book speaks to non-Muslim leaders as well. So we are not going to say, okay, this is a model that is going to be applied only for Muslim or Islamic-based leadership. We are arguing that also non-Muslim leaders can learn a lot out of the scholarship and out of the model that proposed. So we are providing another opportunity for fractionalizing of knowledge. This is one. Also, Muslim leading education organization in non-Muslim spaces can learn a lot out of this, and also the Muslim educators want to utilize Islamic and a human understanding of social justice based on recognition of different, faith-based values, cultures, etc., can also take a lot out of this model that highlights the need of recognizing different cultures throughout cultural relevance pedagogy. That is one of the suggestion here. So the praxis that we suggest is intercultural in its understanding and bridges the gap that has not been, evident in a more ethno-Western centric scholarship.
So we have a question from the chat from Salwa Parvez. She said, thank you for all your wonderful presentations, mashallah. I really appreciate Dr. Tekla's comments, especially about our preconception, preoccupation with Western research and practices, even though they do not map onto our context. My research site is in Karachi, Pakistan, where I find the post-colonial education systems with instruction in English, whereas the home language is Urdu, are actually hampering the formation of reading, writing, and thinking cultures among the literate population. In connection with this, I'd like to ask Dr. Tasneem, in your interviews with the Qatari female educational leaders, did you notice any awareness that a lot of educational practices, including international schooling, is Western, and any efforts to work towards forming indigenous quality educational systems?
Thank you very much for your question. This is quite a good one. So yes, one of the female leaders did actually acknowledge that my research, in fact, gave her the opportunity to reflect very deeply and very reflexively on her leadership practices, which she never actually took out the time to do so. So she did, in her reflection, state that, there is so much coming from the Islamic literature that I never even thought of, when actually carrying out or enacting my leadership practices. And that was one of the, main contributions. I felt very rewarding that at least, a few leaders considered to reflect on their leadership practices. Where is it actually coming from? Is it from the Western literature that I've actually studied and pursued my doctorate in? Or is it actually coming from the way I was raised and brought up, through the values that I was, brought up with the Islamic surroundings? So that is one part of your question. With regards to the international schooling as a nation, and that is not coming from my research, but from my experience of having served in Qatar as an educator and a researcher, the country itself is actually very cognizant of the policy borrowing systems and how they have to more contextualize the curriculum and the experiences for the children there. So the curriculum is, very much contextualized. But again, the medium of instruction, and Rania can add more onto this to elaborate, is still in English, right, Rania? So, but, I think the scholars are aware of what the concern you are raising here, teaching in English, but then it is hampering the skill set that we really want our students or children to take away with. So that's again, policymakers, the educators are considering that, but there is lots to happen in that area. Would you like to add, Rania, something there?
That's a totally different scope and taking us for international
Yes.
schooling and what is happening within specific in country in Arab countries. But Tasneem is referring because I work in Qatar. So there's a huge impact and emphasis of what's happening within international schools and their impact on the generation, the loss of identity, and the impact of not being able to use their native mother tongue, which is Arabic. So there are many issues within the international schooling leadership and how it's affecting the identity of the learners in all aspects. I'm not only discussing about the interviewees with Tasneem, but there's a huge issues within our countries as Arab countries.
Thank you, Dr. Sawalhi and Amatullah. Are there any other questions? Excellent. So we are at the end of our time, I believe, here. And we want to thank
we do
everybody
have,
for joining
I'm
us.
sorry, I think we do have a question from Mr. Muhammad Badr.
Okay, I didn't see anything in the chat. Oh,
It was a show of hands.
okay.
Yes.
Amaarah, what do you want to take this last one?
Sure, we need to be out of the room in 3 minutes.
Okay, we have 3 minutes, so if you could quickly ask your question.
Yes, you allow me to speak now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a very, very important subject. And I'm speaking as in the education administration for Islamic schools here in Houston, Darul Arqam School. I really want to share with you quick, within the 2 minutes, what is the problem. I think the problem is dual education. In all schools in the United States and even overseas, we have a dual education system. And that raises a question, what's really an Islamic school? It is just to have a hijab or teach Quran. I think this is the big challenge we have. Number two, I have a problem with the title of the book. It says Islamic-based education. I like that statement. But when it comes to the word leadership, there is a switch here. Where I'm going to teaching, the delivery, or I'm going to the curricula. And I found that I was not really having opportunity to review the book, but through the presentation, I saw that the focus on teaching. And this way we are putting the carriage in front of the horse. How can I teach and I don't have a curriculum? And that comes to the point of Islamic-based education. In another way, how we connect between religion, the revealed book, and the work of the mind, sciences. That's the way we overcome the dual education system. I think if we...
Brother Mohammed, I'm so sorry to cut you off, but we are, unfortunately, our time is over.
I think you speak from the telephone or from a microphone. I cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I heard Rania and Tasneem very well,
okay.
but I cannot hear you.
Okay,
I will stop anyway.
We're going to close now. Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cohen for the final closing.
I didn't understand your question.
I just want to thank everybody for this really exceptional afternoon. I first want to start and thank the book editor, Dr. Arar, for making time to travel here and share your wisdom and thoughts and perspective and deepen our conversation. I want to appreciate all of the authors of the book who joined us this afternoon, Dr. Sawalhi, Dr. Amatullah, and special thank you to our very own Dr. Amaarah DeCuir here at the School of Education, who is continuing to push on what anti-racism education must look like. And I also want to thank our guest, Dr. Tech. I'm gonna butcher his name. Sorry.
Dr. T is when you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. T, for your insight. And I lastly want to thank all of our staff and students who came to help organize, moderate, share their time. And then thank you to your guests. Thank you to everybody who joined us virtually and here in person. We look forward to getting to share and disseminate. And frankly, this is the first of this type of book talk here, sponsored here. And we are looking forward to the continued conversation, as I very much appreciate the push to how this can impact Islamic-based education, but also education leaders across the country, and really taking down paradigms and binaries that we have falsely constructed. Thank you so much, and I hope you all are safe and healthy and have a great evening.